March 15, 2004. A brutal murder in a quiet Virginia neighborhood left investigators with no suspects, no motive, and a community living in fear for over 2 decades. Then, in 2024, a single DNA match not only solved the case, but revealed the killer had been hiding in plain sight the entire time, living just 3 blocks away from the victim's family. But what made investigators finally look in the one place they never thought to check? And how did a trusted community member fool everyone for 20 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lynchburg, Virginia, March 2004. A city of 65,000, nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where neighbors still wave from their front porches and children ride bicycles on quiet streets. For most residents, the biggest concern is whether the local high school football team will make it to state championships. But on Maple Street, in the heart of the Riverside District, something was about to shatter that peaceful illusion forever. March 15th, 2004. Monday morning, 7:23 a.m. The temperature was a crisp 42 degrees, with morning frost still clinging to car windshields. For 34-year-old elementary school teacher Sarah Catherine Mills, it should have been just another ordinary start to the week. Sarah had taught 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary for 8 years. Colleagues described her as dedicated, always the first to arrive and last to leave. She lived alone in the small blue cottage at 1247 Maple Street, a house she'd inherited from her grandmother just 2 years earlier. Sarah was what you'd call the ideal neighbor. Quiet, responsible, helped out at community events. The kind of person who remembered your birthday and brought you soup when you were sick. Nobody could understand who would want to hurt her, but Sarah never made it to school that Monday morning. When she failed to show up for her 8:15 a.m. staff meeting, something completely out of character, Principal Margaret Henley grew concerned. Sarah had perfect attendance. In 8 years, she'd never missed a day without calling. When 9 a.m. came and went with no word, I knew something was terribly wrong. I called her house, then her cell phone, nothing. At 10:47 a.m., Principal Henley contacted the Lynchburg Police Department to request a welfare check. Officer Marcus Webb was dispatched to 1247 Maple Street at 11:15 a.m., a 12-year veteran of the force. Webb had conducted hundreds of welfare checks. Most ended with embarrassed residents who'd simply overslept or forgotten an appointment. I knocked on the front door first. No answer. I walked around the perimeter looking in windows. The back door was slightly ajar, maybe 6 inches. That's when I called for backup. At 11:43 a.m., Officer Webb entered through the back door, calling out Sarah's name. The kitchen appeared normal. A coffee mug sat on the counter, still half full. A piece of toast lay on a plate, 1 bite taken. The scene suggested Sarah had been in the middle of her morning routine when something interrupted her. But we didn't find her on the 1st floor. Officer Webb climbed the narrow staircase to the 2nd floor. The hallway was dark, with 3 doors, 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. He checked the bathroom first, then the guest bedroom. Both empty. The master bedroom door was closed. I called out one more time before I opened it. What I saw. 23 years on the force, and some images never leave you. At 11:47 a.m., on March 15th, 2004, Officer Marcus Webb discovered the body of Sarah Catherine Mills. Within minutes, 1247 Maple Street became the center of the largest criminal investigation in Lynchburg's recent history. Detective James Morrison, a 15-year veteran of the department, was assigned as lead investigator. Sarah was found in her bedroom, on the floor beside her bed. She'd been struck multiple times with what appeared to be a blunt object. The medical examiner later determined the murder weapon was likely a hammer or similar tool. The initial examination revealed no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared to be stolen. Sarah's purse sat untouched on the kitchen counter, containing $73 in cash and her credit cards. Her laptop computer remained on the living room desk. The victim sustained 7 blunt force trauma wounds to the head and upper torso. Based on lividity patterns and body temperature, I estimated the time of death between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m. Shortly after, she would have woken up. Crime scene technicians spent 14 hours processing every inch of the small cottage. They collected 47 pieces of potential evidence, including fingerprints, hair fibers, and what appeared to be blood spatter patterns. What struck me immediately was how contained the scene was. The violence was concentrated in the bedroom, with minimal disturbance elsewhere in the house. It suggested the perpetrator knew exactly where to find the victim. News of Sarah's murder spread quickly through the tight-knit Riverside district. By late afternoon, neighbors had gathered in small groups along Maple Street, their faces etched with disbelief and fear. Nothing like this ever happened in our neighborhood. Sure, we had the occasional break-in or vandalism, but murder, it was unthinkable. Sarah was loved by everyone. I lived right across the street. I was having my morning coffee around 7 a.m. and looked out my window. Everything seemed normal. Sarah's car was in the driveway. Porch light was off like always. If someone was in that house hurting her, I never heard a thing. The lack of screams or sounds of struggle puzzled investigators. Either the attack happened so quickly that Sarah had no time to call for help, or she knew her attacker and felt no initial threat. We canvassed the entire neighborhood, talking to anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. When detail kept coming up, several residents mentioned seeing an unfamiliar pickup truck parked on Oak Street, 1 block over, around 6:45 a.m. Based on witness descriptions, police released a sketch of the vehicle, a dark-colored pickup truck, possibly a Ford F-150, with an extended cab. The driver was described as a white male, medium build, wearing a baseball cap. Within 48 hours, Detective Morrison had assembled a task force of 6 investigators. Their first priority, understanding Sarah Mills' life, relationships, and any potential threats. We started with the people closest to her: family, friends, colleagues, anyone she'd dated recently. Sarah was single, no children, but she had a wide circle of acquaintances through her. Teaching and volunteer work. Sarah's colleagues painted a picture of a dedicated educator who stayed late to help struggling students and volunteered for every school fundraiser. Her personal life was equally unremarkable. She'd ended an amicable relationship with a fellow teacher 6 months earlier and hadn't been dating anyone since. Sarah was the most gentle person I knew. She never spoke ill of anyone, never had enemies. The idea that someone would want to hurt her was just incomprehensible to all of us. Investigators examined Sarah's phone records, finding nothing unusual. Her last call was to her sister in Richmond on Sunday evening, a routine weekly conversation. Her internet browsing history revealed only educational websites and online shopping for classroom supplies. Everything about Sarah's life suggested she was a low-risk victim. No dangerous associations, no threatening ex-boyfriends, no financial troubles. That made the case even more challenging. We had a victim with no apparent enemies and a crime scene with no obvious motive. The investigation's first major lead came from Sarah's next-door neighbor, 67-year-old retired postal worker Thomas Brennan. I was letting my dog out around 6:30 a.m. when I heard what sounded like someone moving around in Sarah's backyard. Footsteps on gravel, maybe the sound of the back gate opening. I didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it was Sarah taking out trash or something. Brennan's timeline aligned with the estimated time of death, but he hadn't seen the intruder's face. Crime scene technicians found footprints in the soft earth behind Sarah's house, size 11 work boots with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. We were hopeful about the footprint evidence. The wear pattern was unique enough that if we found the boots, we could make a positive match. We checked every shoe store within a 50-mile radius, looking for sales records of that particular brand and size. The boot investigation yielded over 200 potential suspects, each requiring individual follow-up. Meanwhile, The mysterious pickup truck sighting led to another 150 leads as residents called in license plate numbers and descriptions. In those first weeks, we were working 18-hour days, following every possible lead. We interviewed over 400 people, collected DNA samples from 50 potential suspects, and processed hundreds of tips from the public. But nothing was clicking. 3 weeks into the investigation, forensic results began trickling in. The blood evidence confirmed only Sarah's DNA. Fingerprints found throughout the house belonged to Sarah, known friends and family members, or were too partial to be useful for identification. We found one partial fingerprint on the back door frame that didn't match anyone in our database. It was fragmentary, only about 40% of the print was recoverable, but it was enough to potentially exclude or include suspects if we found them. As the investigation continued, the Riverside community struggled to process the loss of one of its most beloved members. On March 25th, 10 days after the murder, Riverside Elementary held a memorial service for Sarah Mills. The turnout was incredible. Current students, former students, their parents, teaching colleagues from across the district. Sarah had touched so many lives in her 8 years here. 8-year-old Ashley Romano, one of Sarah's current students, placed a handmade card on the memorial table. It read, "Miss Mills, you were the best teacher ever. I hope they catch the bad person who hurt you." Ashley had nightmares for weeks after Sarah's death. She kept asking why someone would hurt her teacher. How do you explain senseless violence to a child? Sarah had been planning Ashley's birthday party for the next week. She'd already bought decorations. The fear that gripped the community was palpable. Hardware stores reported a surge in sales of deadbolts and security systems. Parents began walking their children to school instead of letting them ride bikes. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The randomness of it was terrifying. If Sarah wasn't safe, this kind, gentle person who never hurt anyone, then none of us were safe. People started looking at neighbors differently, wondering if they really knew the people around them. 6 weeks into the investigation, Detective Morrison received a call that seemed to offer the first major breakthrough in the case. A woman named Patricia Cummings contacted us. She said her ex-husband had been acting strangely since the murder, and she'd found bloody clothing in their basement laundry room. 38-year-old Michael Cummings worked as a maintenance supervisor at a local manufacturing plant. He'd been separated from his wife for 3 months, though they still lived in the same house in different rooms. Patricia said Michael had scratches on his hands and face the day after Sarah's murder. Michael came home that Monday morning around 8 a.m., which was unusual because he normally left for work by 7:30. He was agitated, kept pacing around the kitchen. When I asked where he'd been, he said he'd had to stop for gas and coffee. Patricia led detectives to the basement, where they found a work shirt and jeans with what appeared to be bloodstains. Michael Cummings was brought in for questioning that afternoon. Cummings initially denied knowing Sarah Mills, but when we showed him her photograph, he admitted he'd seen her around the neighborhood. He claimed he'd never spoken to her, though several witnesses later contradicted that statement. Under pressure, Michael's story began to change. He admitted to walking through the Riverside district on the morning of the murder, claiming he'd been clearing his head before work. When asked about the scratches on his face, he said he'd been working in his yard the previous weekend. We had probable cause for a search warrant. The blood on his clothing, his changing story, his presence in the neighborhood, it all pointed toward him being our suspect. But the forensic evidence told a different story. The blood on Michael. Cummings' clothing turned out to be his own, from a minor. Cut he'd sustained while working on his car. His DNA didn't match any of the evidence collected from Sarah's house. The scratches on his face were consistent with yard work, not defensive wounds from a struggle. When we compared Cummings' DNA to the unknown samples from the crime scene, there was no match. The blood under Sarah's fingernails, the partial fingerprint on the doorframe, none of it connected to him. After 72 hours of intensive investigation, Michael Cummings was released without charges. His wife, Patricia, later admitted that marital problems had made her suspicious of normal behavior. It was devastating. We'd thought we had our man, and the community was expecting an arrest. When we had to let him go, it felt like we were back to square one. The pressure from the public, from Sarah's family, from our own department, it was enormous. The failed arrest highlighted a troubling reality. Despite weeks of intensive investigation, dozens of interviews and hundreds of pieces of evidence, detectives seemed no closer to finding Sarah Mills' killer. After the Cummings lead fell through, I could see the frustration in my detectives' faces. They'd worked tirelessly, followed every protocol, but the case was starting to feel unsolvable. That's when you know you might be looking at a cold case. As spring turned to summer in 2004, the investigation into Sarah Mills' murder began to slow down. Active leads were exhausted, forensic evidence had been processed, and the community's initial outpouring of tips had dwindled to a few calls per week. We never stopped working the case completely, but other crimes demanded attention. New homicides, active investigations. You can't put everything on hold indefinitely. Sarah's case went from daily briefings to weekly updates, then monthly reviews. What none of them knew was that Sarah Mills' killer had been watching the investigation unfold from his living room just 3 blocks away. Confident that his secret was safe, the murder of Sarah Catherine Mills would remain unsolved for the next 20 years. But advances in DNA technology, a dedicated cold case detective, and one crucial piece of evidence that investigators overlooked would eventually bring justice to Maple Street. The question wasn't whether Sarah's killer would be caught, it was whether anyone would believe the shocking truth about who had been living among them all along. By December 2004, the investigation into Sarah Mills' murder had officially stalled. The task force was disbanded, evidence was filed away, and Detective Morrison moved on to new cases. But in a small community like Lynchburg, some wounds never fully heal. For 20 years, Sarah's unsolved murder would cast a shadow over Maple Street, becoming the kind of local tragedy that parents whispered about and children heard in fragments. You never forget a case like Sarah's. Even when you're working on other homicides, other investigations, there's always this nagging feeling in the back of your mind. Did we miss something? Was there a piece of evidence we overlooked? It haunts you. As 2005 dawned, life in the Riverside district slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. New families moved into the neighborhood. Children grew up, but Sarah's blue cottage at 1247 Maple Street remained empty, a constant reminder of the violence that had shattered their sense of security. For years, nobody wanted to buy that house. It sat there with a for sale sign that never came down. Real estate agents would bring people by, but once they learned what happened there, they'd leave pretty quickly. The whole street felt cursed. In 2007, Sarah's family finally found a buyer, a young couple from Richmond who got the house at a significantly reduced price. David and Ellen Pratt knew about the murder but needed an affordable home for their growing family. We weren't superstitious people. We figured what happened to Sarah was a one-time tragedy, not something that would repeat itself. The house had good bones, and the neighborhood seemed quiet. We lived there for 8 years without any problems. But even as new residents settled into 1247 Maple Street, longtime neighbors couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's killer was still out there. Every time I saw a stranger walking down the street, I wondered if it could be him. Every repairman, every delivery driver, every new neighbor, you couldn't help but look at them differently. 20 years later, and I still lock my doors at night. While Lynchburg struggled with its unsolved murder, law enforcement was undergoing a revolution in how cold cases were handled. The creation of CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, in the late 1990s had begun to transform criminal investigations by the mid-2000s. In 2004, when Sarah Mills was murdered, DNA technology was still relatively primitive compared to what we have today. We needed larger samples, better preserved evidence. Many cases that went cold in the early 2000s became solvable years later. As our techniques improved, the Virginia Department of Forensic Science began systematically reviewing cold cases from the 1990s and 2000s, looking for opportunities to apply new DNA technologies. But with hundreds of unsolved murders across the state, progress was slow. Every cold case represents a family that never got closure, a community that never felt completely safe again. But we had limited resources and had to prioritize cases where we thought new technology could make the biggest difference. Sarah Mills' case remained in a filing cabinet at the Lynchburg Police Department, reviewed annually but never actively reinvestigated. The partial fingerprint and DNA samples were preserved, but without new leads or witnesses. There was little investigators could do. In 2012, Detective Morrison retired after 23 years with the department. His replacement in the Criminal Investigations Division was Detective Amanda Foster, a 15-year veteran who had transferred from the Richmond Police Department specifically to work cold cases. I came to Lynchburg because I wanted to focus on unsolved murders. Big cities like Richmond generate so many new cases that cold cases often get pushed aside. I thought a smaller department might give me the opportunity to really dig deep into these forgotten victims. Foster's first week on the job, Chief Bradford handed her a box containing the files from 5 unsolved homicides dating back to the 1990s. Sarah Mills's case was on top. I spent my first month just reading through everything, every interview transcript, every evidence report, every lead that had been followed. Sarah's case stood out because of how thorough the original investigation had been. Morrison and his team had done excellent work, but they were limited by the technology of their time. Foster noticed something that had been overlooked in the original investigation. Crime scene photos showed a small smudge on Sarah's bedroom window, barely visible dirt or grease that could have been left by an intruder's hand. The window was about 4 feet off the ground on the outside, accessible from the backyard. If someone had been watching Sarah, maybe planning the attack, they might have looked through that window. In 2004, testing that smudge wouldn't have been practical. By 2012, it was worth a shot. The smudge on Sarah's window was carefully removed and sent to the Virginia Department of Forensic Science. Using new extraction techniques, technicians were able to recover a small amount of touch DNA, genetic material left behind by skin cells. Touch DNA was a game changer for cold cases. We could now get profiles from evidence that would have been useless 10 years earlier. The amount of DNA in that window smudge was tiny, but it was enough to generate a partial profile. The profile contained markers from at least 2 different people, Sarah Mills and an unknown male. But when it was run through CODIS, there were no matches. The DNA went into the database, waiting for a future hit that might never come. It was frustrating. We had new evidence, potentially from the killer, but without a match it was just more information sitting in a file. I started thinking about other approaches, not just waiting for DNA hits, but actively investigating the case from new angles. Foster began what she called a behavioral analysis of Sarah's murder, looking at the crime scene through the lens of modern criminal psychology. Detective Foster asked me to review the case files and crime scene photos. What struck me immediately was the personal nature of the attack. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a random killing. Someone wanted Sarah Mills specifically dead. The analysis suggested that Sarah's killer likely knew her routine, had observed her house, and possibly had interacted with her before the murder. He was probably a local resident, someone who could move through the neighborhood without attracting attention. The timing of the attack, early morning, just as Sarah was starting her daily routine, suggested extensive surveillance. This wasn't someone who got lucky. This was someone who had been planning and watching, armed with this new psychological profile. Foster began re-interviewing witnesses from 2004, focusing on anyone who might have had contact with Sarah in the weeks before her death. Detective Foster asked me questions that the first investigators never thought to ask. Did Sarah mention any strange phone calls? Has she noticed anyone hanging around her house? Did she seem worried about anything in the weeks before she died? One detail emerged that had been missed in the original investigation. 3 weeks before her murder, Sarah had mentioned to several colleagues that someone had been going through her trash. Sarah said she'd noticed her garbage cans were in different positions when she came home from work. She thought maybe it was raccoons at first, but then she found some of her mail scattered in the yard. She was starting to think someone was deliberately going through her trash. This information had never made it into the original police reports. In 2004, it seemed like a minor concern, unrelated to the murder investigation. Trash surveillance is a classic stalking behavior. If someone was going through Sarah's garbage, they were learning about her life, her routines, her habits, maybe even her schedule. It suggested this wasn't a random crime at all. Foster obtained Sarah's credit card and phone records going back 6 months before her death, looking for patterns that might have been missed. She found that Sarah had been shopping at the same grocery store every Tuesday evening, had her car serviced at the same garage every 3 months, and stopped for coffee at the same cafe every Friday morning. Sarah was a creature of habit, which made her predictable. If someone was watching her, they would have learned her routine pretty quickly. The question was, who had the opportunity to observe her closely enough to know when she'd be alone and vulnerable? Foster spent dozens of hours walking through the Riverside district, talking to current residents and trying to track down people who had lived there in 2004. Many had moved away, but a few long-time residents remained. Detective Foster came by several times over the years. She'd asked me to walk through that morning again, try to remember any details I might have forgotten. She was much more thorough than the first detectives, not because they weren't good at their job, but because she had time to really focus on one case. During one of these walks, Brennan mentioned something he'd never told police before. In the weeks before Sarah's murder, he'd noticed the same dark pickup truck parked on Oak Street multiple times. I didn't think much of it at the time because there was construction going on in the neighborhood. Lots of work trucks coming and going. But this one truck was always parked in the same spot, and I never saw anyone working nearby. Foster checked city records and found that the only construction project in the area during that time period was a small deck addition 2 blocks away from Oak Street, nowhere near where the truck had been parked. This was potentially huge. If the same truck had been in the neighborhood repeatedly before the murder, it wasn't connected to any legitimate work project. Someone was using it as a surveillance position. Foster created a detailed timeline of Sarah's life in the 6 months before her death, mapping every known activity, every social interaction, every routine. She cross-referenced this with all the reported sightings of the mysterious pickup truck. The pattern was clear once I laid it all out. The truck sightings corresponded with times when Sarah would have been most visible, coming home from work, taking out her garbage, working in her garden on weekends. Someone was definitely watching her. Foster also discovered that Sarah had filed a complaint with her internet service provider about slow connection speeds in February 2004, just weeks before her death. A technician had come to her house to check the lines. I tracked down the work order. A cable repair van had been in Sarah's neighborhood the day before her murder, supposedly fixing service issues. But when I contacted the company, they had no record of any service calls to Maple Street that week. The fake service call suggested that Sarah's killer had not only been watching her, but had also found a way to get close to her house without arousing. Suspicion at Foster's renewed investigation attracted media attention in 2015 when a local TV station ran a story about the case on the anniversary of Sarah's murder. The coverage generated several new tips, including one that would prove crucial. I had moved away from Lynchburg in 2005, but when I saw the story on the news, I knew I had to call. I remembered seeing a man in work clothes near Sarah's house the week before she died. He was looking at the electric meter, but something about him seemed off. Santos had been walking her dog when she encountered the man. He was wearing a utility company uniform and carrying a clipboard. But when she asked if there was a power problem in the neighborhood, he seemed nervous and quickly walked away. I got a good look at his face. He was probably in his 30s, average height, brown hair. What stood out was that he had very pale blue eyes, almost gray, and he was left-handed. I noticed because of how he held his clipboard. Santos' description was more detailed than any witness account from the original investigation. Foster worked with a police artist to create a composite sketch, which was distributed throughout the community. Finally, we had a face to go with our suspect. Someone who could pose as a utility worker who had been casing Sarah's house, who matched the general description of the pickup truck driver. We were getting closer. As Foster continued her investigation, forensic science kept advancing. In 2018, Virginia became one of the first states to begin using genealogy, the same technique that had been used to catch the Golden State Killer in California. Genealogy opened up possibilities we'd never had before. Instead of waiting for an exact DNA match in CODIS, we could potentially identify suspects through their relatives who had submitted DNA to ancestry websites. The touch DNA from Sarah's bedroom window was submitted for genetic genealogy analysis. The process would take months, but for the first time in nearly 15 years, investigators had hope for a breakthrough. I'd been working on Sarah's case for 6 years at that point. I'd followed hundreds of leads, interviewed dozens of people, analyzed every piece of evidence multiple times. Genetic genealogy felt like our last best hope for getting answers. While Foster worked to solve the case, the Riverside District continued to grapple with Sarah's legacy. In 2019, 15 years after her death, the community organized a memorial scholarship fund in her name. We wanted to make sure Sarah's memory lived on in a positive way. The scholarship goes to graduating seniors who plan to become teachers, young people who share Sarah's passion for education and helping children. The first recipient was Ashley Romano, the same student who had placed a handmade card at Sarah's memorial service in 2004. Miss Mills was only my teacher for 2 months, but she changed my life. The way she made every student feel special and important, that's the kind of teacher I wanted to become. Getting this scholarship felt like she was still looking out for me, even after all these years. By 2020, Detective Foster had assembled the most complete picture of Sarah Mills's murder ever created. She had new witness testimony, advanced DNA evidence, detailed behavioral analysis, and a comprehensive timeline of the killer's surveillance activities. We knew more about this case than the original investigators ever could have imagined. We had a physical description of the suspect, evidence of his surveillance methods, and touch DNA that could potentially identify him. What we didn't know was that we already had his name in our files. As 2024 began, Foster submitted a request to have the genetic genealogy analysis expedited. Advanced AI algorithms were now being used to analyze family tree connections, dramatically reducing the time needed to identify suspects. The technology had reached a point where we could potentially solve decades-old cases in weeks instead of years. Sarah Mills's case was about to become a testament to the power of persistence and advancing science. What none of them suspected was that the breakthrough would come not from the genetic genealogy analysis, but from a completely unexpected source, a confession that would shock everyone who thought they knew the quiet neighborhood of Maple Street. For 16 years, Detective Foster had methodically rebuilt the case against Sarah Mills's killer, gathering evidence that the original investigators never could have obtained. The DNA was processed, the witnesses re-interviewed, the timeline reconstructed. By early 2024, everything was in place for the arrest that would finally bring justice to Maple Street. But the identity of the killer would prove more shocking than anyone had imagined, because he had never really left the neighborhood at all. February 14th, 2024, Valentine's Day. Detective Amanda Foster was reviewing case files in her office when her phone rang. On the other end was Dr. Sarah Thompson from the Virginia Department of Forensic Science with news that would change everything. I told Amanda we had a hit on the genetic genealogy analysis, but it wasn't what she was expecting. The family tree we'd constructed pointed to someone local, someone who'd been in the system all along. When Dr. Thompson told me the suspect's name, I thought there had to be a mistake. I knew this person. The whole community knew him. He'd been interviewed during the original investigation, as a witness, not a suspect. The genetic genealogy analysis had identified 52-year-old William "Bill" Crawford, a longtime Lynchburg resident who lived on Pine Street, exactly 3 blocks from Sarah Mills' former home on Maple Street. Bill Crawford was our local hero. Volunteer firefighter for 18 years, coached Little League Baseball, organized the annual neighborhood block party. If you'd asked anyone in Riverside who they trusted most, his name would have been at the top of the list. Crawford had been questioned briefly in April 2004, just weeks after Sarah's murder. As a volunteer firefighter who often drove through the neighborhood on his way to the station, detectives had asked if he'd noticed anything unusual the morning of March 15th. I remember Bill Crawford. Helpful, cooperative, seemed genuinely concerned about Sarah's murder. He told us he'd driven through the area around 6 a.m. that morning on his way to an early training session at the firehouse. Said everything looked normal to him, but Detective Foster's review of the original files revealed something troubling. Crawford's 2004 interview had lasted only 15 minutes. He'd never been asked for an alibi for the specific time of the murder, never been fingerprinted, never provided a DNA sample. In 2004, Bill was seen as a community asset, not a potential suspect. The idea that a volunteer firefighter, someone who spent his time saving lives, could be a killer was unthinkable. But that's exactly what made him the perfect hiding place. Foster immediately initiated covert surveillance of Crawford while she built her case. What she observed over the following weeks was chilling. Bill still drove through the Riverside district every morning, just like he had 20 years ago. Same route, same time, between 6:15 and 6:30 a.m. He'd slow down when he passed 1247 Maple Street, sometimes stopping his truck to stare at the house. Crawford's morning routine included stopping at the same coffee shop Sarah had frequented, shopping at the same grocery store, even using the same gas station. For 20 years, he'd been retracing her steps. Mr. Crawford was a regular customer for as long as I can remember. Always ordered the same thing, large black coffee, no sugar. He'd sit in the corner booth and read the newspaper. Very quiet, very polite. I never would have suspected anything. Foster's team placed cameras near Crawford's home and followed his daily activities. They discovered he had kept a detailed scrapbook of newspaper articles about Sarah's murder, along with photos of her house taken from various angles. The scrapbook was like a trophy collection. Every article about the investigation, every anniversary story, every update about the case, he'd saved them all. There were also photos that appeared to be taken from inside his truck, showing Sarah's house at different times of day. While maintaining surveillance, Foster worked with prosecutors to build an airtight case. The touch DNA from Sarah's bedroom window was tested again, using the most advanced techniques available in 2024, when we compared Bill Crawford's DNA profile from the genetic genealogy analysis to the touch DNA from the window, it was a perfect match. The statistical probability of it being someone else was less than 1 in 500 billion. Foster also discovered that Crawford had purchased a dark blue Ford F-150 pickup truck in January 2004, just 2 months before Sarah's murder. Vehicle registration records showed he'd owned the truck for 3 years before trading it in for a newer model. The timeline was damning. He bought the truck, used it to surveil Sarah for months, committed the murder, then got rid of the evidence by trading in the vehicle. It was methodical, calculated planning. A review of Crawford's work schedule at the electric company where he'd been employed since 1998 revealed another crucial detail. In February 2004, he'd been assigned to conduct meter readings in the Riverside district, giving him legitimate reasons to be in the neighborhood. Bill was one of our most reliable employees, always volunteered for extra shifts, never complained about difficult assignments. When he asked to take on the Riverside route, I thought he was just being helpful. I never imagined he had ulterior motives. Further investigation revealed that Crawford had used his position with the electric company to case Sarah's house directly. Company records showed he'd visited 12 and 47 Maple Street on March 10, 2004, just 5 days before the murder, under the pretense of checking for electrical problems reported by a neighbor. There was no record of any neighbor complaining about electrical issues. Bill had fabricated the service call as an excuse to get close to Sarah's house, probably to observe her security measures and daily routine up close. The fake utility worker that witness Maria Santos had described matched Crawford's appearance in 2004 perfectly, down to his height, build, and distinctive pale blue eyes. When Detective Foster showed me a photo lineup including Bill Crawford's 2004 driver's license picture, I identified him immediately. Those eyes were unmistakable. I'd been looking at them for 20 years at community events, never knowing I'd seen a killer. With overwhelming evidence against Crawford, Foster developed a strategy to elicit a confession. She arranged for Crawford to be brought in for what he believed was a routine interview about a recent burglary in his neighborhood. Bill was comfortable around the police. He'd worked with us on fire department calls for years. I wanted to use that familiarity to get him talking before he realized he was actually a suspect in Sarah's murder on March 8, 2024, exactly 20 years and 1 week after Sarah's death. Crawford arrived voluntarily at the Lynchburg Police Department. He was relaxed, even chatty with officers he recognized from joint emergency responses. I started with general questions about the neighborhood, about his daily routines, about whether he'd noticed any suspicious activity lately. Bill was completely at ease, probably thinking he was helping us solve another case. 30 minutes into the interview, Foster shifted the conversation to cold cases. I mentioned that we were using new DNA technology to solve old murders, including some local cases. Bill's demeanor changed immediately. He became fidgety, started avoiding eye contact, kept checking his watch. Foster then placed a folder on the table between them and slowly opened it to reveal crime scene photos from Sarah Mills's house. I told Bill we'd solved Sarah's murder using genetic genealogy. I explained that we had his DNA from her bedroom window, that we knew about the truck, that we'd traced his fake service calls. I watched 20 years of careful planning crumble in about 30 seconds. Crawford's initial response was denial, but as Foster presented evidence piece by piece, his story began to fall apart. First, he said he'd never been to Sarah's house. Then when I showed him the service records, he admitted to the fake call, but claimed it was innocent. When I presented the DNA evidence, he finally broke down. At 2:47 p.m. on March 8, 2024, William Crawford confessed to the murder of Sarah Catherine Mills. Bill's confession was detailed and chilling. He admitted to stalking Sarah for months, learning her routines, planning the attack carefully. What shocked me most was his motive, or rather, his complete lack of one. Crawford told investigators he'd become obsessed with Sarah after seeing her at a community event in late 2003. He'd never spoken to her directly, but began following her, studying her habits, fantasizing about having a relationship with her. Bill said he'd convinced himself that Sarah was meant to be with him. He believed if he could just get her alone, he could make her understand they belonged together. When he finally broke into her house that morning and she screamed and tried to run, he said he lost control. The confession revealed the extent of Crawford's deception. For 20 years, he'd attended community meetings where Sarah's murder was discussed, participated in neighborhood safety initiatives prompted by her death, even contributed to the Memorial Scholarship Fund established in her name. Bill had been living a double life for 2 decades. To everyone around him, He was a pillar of the community. But privately, he was reliving his crime, staying close to the investigation, probably enjoying the fact that he'd fooled everyone. At 4:15 p.m. on March 8, 2024, William Crawford was formally arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Catherine Mills. The arrest warrant was signed exactly 20 years, 3 weeks and 6 days after Sarah's death. It was surreal watching Bill Crawford being led away in handcuffs. This was someone I'd worked with on dozens of emergency calls, someone I'd socialized with at department barbecues. The realization that we'd been sharing a beer with a killer was deeply disturbing. News of Crawford's arrest spread through Lynchburg within hours. For residents of the Riverside district, the revelation was devastating. Bill Crawford had been to my house for dinner. My children played on his little league teams. When I heard he'd killed Sarah, I felt physically sick. How do you reconcile 20 years of thinking you know someone with the truth that they're a monster? The worst part was realizing how many times we'd all talked to Bill about Sarah's murder over the years. At block parties, at community meetings. He'd stand there nodding along while we discussed our fears about the killer still being out there. He was right there the whole time. The arrest of Bill Crawford sent shockwaves through Lynchburg's tight-knit community. Residents struggled to process the betrayal of someone they'd trusted and admired for decades. I kept thinking about all the times Bill had expressed sympathy about Sarah's death, all the times he'd asked how the investigation was progressing. He'd looked me in the eye and pretended to care about finding her killer, knowing all along that he was the one who'd taken her from us, Crawford's ex-wife. Patricia came forward with information that painted a disturbing picture of his behavior in the months following Sarah's murder. Bill became obsessed with true crime shows after 2004. He'd watch them constantly, taking notes, studying how killers got caught. At the time, I thought it was just a hobby. Now I realize he was trying to stay one step ahead of the investigation. Patricia also revealed that Crawford had insisted on moving to a house with a clear view of Maple Street in 2006, claiming he wanted to keep an eye on the neighborhood for safety reasons. From our bedroom window, Bill could see Sarah's old house perfectly. I used to find him standing there at night just staring. When I asked what he was looking at, he'd say he was watching for suspicious activity. I never imagined he was reliving what he'd done. Crawford's confession also devastated the Lynchburg Volunteer Fire Department, where he'd served for 18 years. Bill was one of our most dedicated volunteers. He'd respond to calls at all hours, never complained about dangerous assignments, always put the safety of others first. Learning that someone capable of such selfless acts was also capable of murder was incomprehensible. The department launched an internal review of Crawford's activities, looking for any signs they might have missed. What they found was a man who'd compartmentalized his life with frightening efficiency. Bill's service record was exemplary. He'd saved lives, fought fires, responded to medical emergencies, all while carrying the secret of what he'd done to Sarah. It made us question everything we thought we knew about reading people's character. With Crawford's confession, investigators finally had answers to questions that had puzzled them for 20 years. The hammer used to kill Sarah had been disposed of in the James River the same day as the murder. The work boots with the distinctive wear pattern had been burned in Crawford's backyard fire pit. Bill had thought of everything. He'd destroyed physical evidence, created alibis through his volunteer work, and maintained a public persona that made him above suspicion. If not for advances in DNA technology, he might never have been caught. Crawford also revealed that he'd returned to Sarah's house multiple times in the weeks following her murder, ostensibly as part of the Volunteer Fire Department's community outreach efforts to help neighbors feel safe. While we were processing the crime scene and interviewing witnesses, Bill was walking through Sarah's house wearing his fire department uniform, probably reliving his crime. The audacity of it was breathtaking. As prosecutors prepared their case against Crawford, they faced the challenge of explaining how someone could maintain such an elaborate deception for 20 years. Bill Crawford represents every community's worst nightmare, the trusted neighbor who's actually a predator. Our case would need to show not just that he killed Sarah Mills, but how he manipulated an entire community's trust to hide his crime. The genetic genealogy evidence was rock solid, but prosecutors wanted to ensure the jury understood the full scope of Crawford's deception and the meticulous planning that had gone into both the murder and the subsequent cover-up. This wasn't a crime of passion that someone regretted. This was a calculated killing followed by 2 decades of calculated lies. Bill Crawford had inserted himself into Sarah's story as a concerned community member while knowing all along that he was the author of her tragic ending. The arrest of Bill Crawford solved one of Virginia's most perplexing cold cases, but it raised disturbing questions about how well we truly know the people in our communities. For the residents of Maple Street, justice was finally within reach, but the psychological scars left by 20 years of misplaced trust would take much longer to heal. As Crawford awaited trial, investigators began to wonder what other secrets might be hiding behind the friendly faces of small-town America. September 12, 2024. 6 months after his arrest, William Crawford sat in the Lynchburg Circuit Court as jury selection began for what would become one of Virginia's most watched murder trials. For a community that had lived with Sarah Mills' unsolved murder for 20 years, the prospect of finally getting answers brought both relief and trepidation. The case against Crawford presented unique challenges from the moment charges were filed. Finding an impartial jury in a city where the defendant had been a beloved community figure would prove nearly impossible. In 30 years on the bench, I'd never seen a case where so many potential jurors had personal relationships with the defendant. We had to dismiss nearly 200 people before we could seat 12 jurors who claimed they could be objective. Crawford's defense team, led by veteran attorney Michael Rodriguez, faced the daunting task of defending someone whose confession had been recorded and whose DNA was found at the crime scene. Our challenge wasn't proving Bill's innocence. The evidence made that impossible. Our job was to save his life. Virginia still has the death penalty, and the prosecution was seeking it aggressively. District Attorney Sarah Martinez assembled a prosecution team specifically for the Crawford case, knowing that the eyes of law enforcement agencies across Virginia would be watching how they handled the genetic genealogy evidence. This case would set precedents for how genetic genealogy evidence is presented in court. We had to be absolutely thorough in explaining the science to the jury while also telling Sarah's story in a way that honored her memory. The voir dire process took 3 weeks, with attorneys questioning over 400 potential jurors. The defense sought people who could separate Crawford's community service from his crime, while prosecutors looked for jurors who wouldn't be swayed by his former reputation. It was fascinating to watch people's reactions when they learned about Crawford's volunteer work. You could see the cognitive dissonance. How do you reconcile someone who saved lives with someone who took a life? Some potential jurors simply couldn't process it. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, ranging in age from 28 to 67. None had direct personal relationships with Crawford, though several had heard of his volunteer work through media coverage. I went into that courtroom thinking I knew what to expect from a murder trial. I'd seen them on TV, read about them in newspapers. But nothing prepared me for the reality of looking at someone who seemed so normal and trying to understand how they could commit such a horrific act. The trial began on October 8, 2024, exactly 7 months after Crawford's confession. Prosecutor Martinez's opening statement painted a picture of calculated predation masked by community service. I told the jury that William Crawford had spent 20 years hiding behind a badge and a volunteer's vest, using the community's trust as camouflage while he relived his crime every single day. His heroic acts weren't acts of conscience. They were performance art designed to deflect suspicion. Martinez methodically outlined the prosecution's case. The genetic genealogy evidence, The pattern of surveillance, the fake service calls, and ultimately, Crawford's detailed confession. We had what prosecutors dream of, a confession, DNA evidence, and a clear timeline of premeditation. But we also had the challenge of explaining to the jury how someone could compartmentalize their life so completely. Defense attorney Rodriguez took a different approach, acknowledging Crawford's guilt while arguing for his mental state. I didn't dispute the facts. Bill Crawford killed Sarah Mills, and that was inexcusable. But I asked the jury to consider how someone could live two completely contradictory lives for 20 years. This wasn't the behavior of a person with normal mental faculties. The prosecution's strategy was to present evidence chronologically, building from Crawford's initial obsession with Sarah through to his confession 20 years later. Explaining genetic genealogy to a jury was challenging. I had to make sure they understood that this wasn't just a lucky match, it was scientifically rigorous analysis that conclusively identified Crawford as the source of the DNA on Sarah's window. Thompson spent 2 days on the witness stand, walking jurors through the process of extracting touch DNA from the bedroom window, and how genetic genealogy had led investigators to Crawford's family tree. The DNA testimony was overwhelming. Dr. Thompson used charts and diagrams to show how they tracked the genetic markers back to Crawford's relatives, then to him specifically. By the time she finished, there was no doubt in my mind about the scientific evidence. Detective Foster's testimony took up 3 full days as she recounted the painstaking process of rebuilding the case from scratch. I wanted the jury to understand that this wasn't a case that was solved overnight. It took years of re-examining evidence, finding new witnesses, and applying new technology. Sarah Mills deserved that level of dedication. Foster presented evidence of Crawford's surveillance activities, including the scrapbook found in his home and the photographs he'd taken of Sarah's house over the years. When the jury saw those photos, images of Sarah's house taken from inside Crawford's truck at different times of day, you could feel the atmosphere in the courtroom change. The stalking behavior was undeniable. Maria Santos flew in from Florida to testify about her encounter with Crawford during his fake utility service call. I was nervous about testifying, but I knew I owed it to Sarah when I identified Crawford in the courtroom as the fake utility worker I'd seen. He wouldn't look at me. After 20 years of wondering if I could have done something to prevent her death, finally being able to point to her killer was both terrifying and liberating. Thomas Brennan, now 87 years old, provided crucial testimony about the sounds he'd heard the morning of the murder. The prosecutor asked me to describe exactly what I'd heard that morning. The footsteps on gravel, the sound of the back gate. Then they played a recording of someone walking through Sarah's backyard, and it was exactly the same sound. I'll never forget the look on Crawford's face when he heard it. Crawford's ex-wife, Patricia, delivered some of the most damaging testimony, describing his obsessive behavior in the years following Sarah's murder. Testifying against Bill was the hardest thing I've ever done. We'd been married for 12 years, and I'd loved him. But when I learned what he'd done to that poor woman, I knew I had to tell the truth about what I'd observed. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the videotaped confession Crawford had given to Detective Foster in March 2024. We played the entire 4-hour confession for the jury. I wanted them to hear Crawford's own words, describing how he'd stalked Sarah, planned her murder, and then spent 20 years deceiving everyone around him. The courtroom was silent as Crawford's voice filled the room, calmly describing the details of his crime. Watching that confession was surreal. Crawford spoke about killing Sarah Mills the same way you might describe your morning routine. There was no emotion, no remorse, just a matter of fact, recounting of how he'd planned and executed a murder. Crawford's description of returning to Sarah's house in his firefighter uniform while the investigation was ongoing particularly shocked the jury when he talked about walking through the crime scene in his fire department uniform, pretending to be there for community safety. I felt sick. The calculation and deception involved was beyond anything I could have imagined. Rodriguez's defense strategy centered on Crawford's mental state and the argument that someone with normal psychological functioning couldn't have maintained such an elaborate deception for 20 years. I testified that Crawford exhibited characteristics consistent with antisocial personality disorder and narcissistic traits. His ability to compartmentalize his criminal behavior while maintaining a public persona was evidence of severe psychological dysfunction. The defense called several character witnesses, including fellow firefighters and parents of children Crawford had coached, attempting to show the jury the complexity of his personality. Testifying for the defense was painful, but I felt I had to be honest about the Bill Crawford I knew. He'd saved my life during a warehouse fire in 2018. He'd also helped organize fundraisers for families who'd lost their homes. The idea that this same person could be a killer was incomprehensible. I wasn't asking the jury to excuse what Bill had done. I was asking them to understand that his mental illness didn't absolve him of responsibility, but it should be considered when determining his sentence. Against his attorney's advice, Crawford insisted on testifying in his own defense, a decision that would prove disastrous. Bill was convinced he could explain his actions in a way that would make the jury understand. I told him it was a mistake, but he was adamant about speaking for himself. Crawford's testimony began with an apology to Sarah's family and an acknowledgement of his guilt. But as prosecutors cross-examined him, his responses revealed a disturbing lack of genuine remorse. I asked Crawford why he'd attended Sarah's memorial service, why he'd contributed to her scholarship fund, why he'd participated in neighborhood safety meetings prompted by his own crime. His answers showed that he'd viewed these activities as a game, a way to prove his superiority over the investigators. Crawford's demeanor on the stand was calm and analytical, describing his actions with the same detachment he'd shown during his confession. When Crawford testified, I kept waiting for him to show some real emotion, some genuine remorse for what he'd done. Instead, he seemed almost proud of how well he'd hidden his crime. It was chilling. Under cross-examination, Crawford admitted that he'd never felt guilt about killing Sarah Mills, only fear about getting caught. That admission, that he'd felt no guilt, only fear, showed the jury exactly who we were dealing with. This wasn't someone who'd made a terrible mistake and spent 20 years suffering with remorse. This was someone who'd enjoyed his secret. The trial featured extensive testimony about genetic genealogy, as both sides recognized its importance in establishing precedent for future cases. I explained to the jury how genetic genealogy differs from traditional DNA matching. Instead of looking for exact matches in criminal databases, we analyze family relationships through publicly available genealogy websites to identify potential suspects. The defense attempted to challenge the reliability of genetic genealogy, but their expert witnesses couldn't dispute the accuracy of the technique when properly applied. I testified that genetic genealogy was a relatively new field and that protocols were still being developed. But I had to admit that in Crawford's case, the analysis had been conducted properly and the results were scientifically sound. After 3 weeks of testimony, both sides presented their closing arguments to an emotionally drained jury. I reminded the jury that this case wasn't just about bringing Bill Crawford to justice. It was about honoring Sarah Mills' memory and ensuring that her killer could never harm anyone else. Crawford had shown no remorse, no genuine acceptance of responsibility for his actions. Martinez emphasized that Crawford's 20 years of deception proved his dangerousness to society. Bill Crawford spent 2 decades proving that he could look directly into the faces of people he'd betrayed and lie without flinching. A person capable of that level of sustained deception is capable of anything. Rodriguez's closing argument focused on Crawford's mental illness and asked the jury to consider life imprisonment instead of the death penalty. I told the jury that executing Bill Crawford wouldn't bring Sarah Mills back, and it wouldn't undo the pain he'd caused. But keeping him locked away for the rest of his life would ensure he could never hurt anyone again. While acknowledging his severe mental illness, the jury retired to deliberate on October 31st, 2024, Halloween afternoon. The symbolism wasn't lost on observers, a day traditionally associated with masks and hidden identities. The deliberation was emotionally exhausting. We had to determine not just whether Crawford was guilty, that was obvious, but whether he deserved to die for his crime. Some jurors felt his mental illness was a mitigating factor, while others thought his 20 years of deception made him more dangerous, not less. The jury requested to review Crawford's confession video twice during their deliberations, focusing particularly on his descriptions of planning the murder and his subsequent deception. What struck us during the second viewing was how Crawford seemed almost proud of his ability to fool everyone. There was no remorse in his voice, just satisfaction at having outsmarted the police and the community for so long. After 18 hours of deliberations spread over 3 days, the jury reached their verdict on November 3rd, 2024, exactly 8 months after Crawford's arrest. The jury foreman stood to deliver their decision. We, the jury, find the defendant, William Crawford, guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Sarah Catherine Mills. The guilty verdict came as no surprise, but the jury's recommendation on sentencing was more contentious. By a vote of 7-5, we recommend that William Crawford be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, rather than death. The narrow margin reflected the jury's struggle to balance Crawford's heinous crime against their concerns about his mental state. 5 of us felt that Crawford's complete lack of remorse and his 20 years of deception warranted the death penalty. 7 of us felt that his mental illness, while not excusing his actions, made life imprisonment more appropriate. Judge Henley scheduled sentencing for December 15th, 2024, giving both sides time to prepare their final arguments about Crawford's fate. This case challenged everything I thought I knew about human nature. How someone could commit such a brutal crime and then spend 20 years living a lie while looking their victims' friends and family in the eye was almost incomprehensible. The sentencing hearing would give Sarah's family and friends their first opportunity to directly address Crawford about the impact of his crime, a moment many had been waiting 20 years to have. The guilty verdict brought closure to one of Virginia's most perplexing cold cases. But questions remained about Crawford's ultimate fate. As the community prepared for the sentencing hearing, residents of Maple Street grappled with a troubling reality. Their nightmare was ending, but their trust in their neighbors had been forever shattered. The man who had fooled them for 20 years was finally facing justice, but the psychological scars he'd left behind would take much longer to heal. December 15th, 2024, nearly 9 months after William Crawford's arrest and 20 years. 9 months since Sarah Mills' murder, the Lynchburg Circuit Courthouse prepared for the final chapter in one of Virginia's most shocking cold case revelations. The sentencing hearing would give Sarah's loved ones their first opportunity to directly confront her killer and give Crawford his last chance to show remorse. Judge Patricia Henley opened the sentencing hearing by explaining that while the jury had recommended life imprisonment, she had the authority to impose the death penalty if she felt it was warranted. Before I make my final decision, I want to hear from those who knew Sarah Mills best. Their words will help me understand the full scope of the harm caused by Mr. Crawford's actions. Sarah's sister, Rebecca Mills Cooper, had driven from Richmond to deliver the first victim impact statement. She hadn't spoken publicly about Sarah's murder in 20 years. Your Honor, Sarah was supposed to be my maid of honor at my wedding in 2005. She was supposed to be the aunt who spoiled my children and taught them to love learning the way she did. Bill Crawford didn't just kill my sister. He stole 20 years of memories that my family will never have. Rebecca's voice broke as she described the family gatherings that felt incomplete, the holidays overshadowed by Sarah's absence, and the constant wondering about who had taken her sister's life. The worst part was not knowing. For 20 years, we lived with the fear that Sarah's killer was still out there, that he might hurt someone else's daughter, someone else's sister. Learning that he was living 3 blocks away, that he was someone the community trusted, makes the betrayal even worse. Principal Margaret Henley, now retired but still carrying the weight of losing one of her teachers, addressed the court about Sarah's professional legacy. Sarah Mills was the teacher that every parent hoped their child would have. She stayed after school to help struggling students, bought supplies with her own money, and made every child feel special. Mr. Crawford didn't just take Sarah's life. He robbed hundreds of future students of an extraordinary educator. Jennifer Scott, Sarah's closest friend and teaching colleague, had prepared extensive remarks, but found herself too emotional to read them all. "I've been angry for 20 years, but I didn't know who to be angry at. Now I know. Mr. Crawford, you sat in meetings where we discussed our fears about Sarah's killer. You looked me in the eye and pretended to care about finding justice for her. That level of deception is unforgivable." Ashley Romano, the former student who had received Sarah's memorial scholarship, spoke about how the murder had shaped her entire worldview. "Miss Mills was my teacher for only 2 months, but she changed my life. When she was killed, I learned that bad things happen to good people for no reason. That knowledge has followed me for 20 years. Mr. Crawford, you stole my innocence and the innocence of every child who loved Miss Mills." Fire Chief Marcus Webb delivered a statement on behalf of the Lynchburg Volunteer Fire Department, addressing the unique betrayal felt by Crawford's fellow first responders. Bill Crawford swore an oath to protect and serve this community. He fought fires alongside us, responded to medical emergencies, and saved lives. To learn that he was simultaneously taking a life and lying to our faces for 20 years has shaken the foundation of everything we believe about brotherhood and trust in the fire service. Chief Webb announced that the department had established new background check procedures and psychological evaluations for all volunteers in response to Crawford's deception. "We failed Sarah Mills and this community by not seeing through Bill Crawford's facade. We're implementing new safeguards to ensure this never happens again, but we know that nothing can undo the damage he's caused to our reputation and our relationships with the people we serve." After 45 minutes of victim impact statements, Judge Henley asked Crawford if he wished to address the court before sentencing. Against his attorney's advice, Crawford chose to speak. "Your Honor, I want to apologize to Sarah's family, to this community, and to my fellow firefighters. What I did to Sarah was inexcusable, and I've spent 20 years knowing that I took the life of an innocent person." Crawford's statement was brief and delivered in the same emotionless tone that had characterized his confession and trial testimony. "I can't explain why I killed Sarah Mills, and I can't undo what I did. I accept responsibility for my actions, and I'm prepared to face whatever sentence you impose. I only ask that you consider the good I have tried to do in the years since, even though I know it can never make up for the evil I committed." The apology felt hollow to many in the courtroom, lacking the genuine remorse that Sarah's loved ones had hoped to hear. Even his apology felt calculated, like everything else he'd done for 20 years. There was no real emotion, no genuine understanding of the pain he'd caused. It was just more performance from someone who'd been performing for 2 decades. Judge Henley recessed for 2 hours to consider her sentencing decision. When court reconvened at 3:30 p.m., the gallery was packed with community members who had followed the case for months. "Mr. Crawford, in my 30 years on the bench, I have never encountered a case that so clearly demonstrates the capacity for human deception. Your ability to maintain a facade of community service while harboring the secret of your crime represents a level of psychological manipulation that defies comprehension. Judge Henley methodically reviewed the evidence, Crawford's confession, and the impact statements before announcing her decision. While the jury recommended life imprisonment, I must consider whether your crime and your subsequent 20 years of deception warrant the ultimate penalty. After careful consideration, I am persuaded that your demonstrated ability to deceive makes you an ongoing danger to society that cannot be mitigated by the possibility of rehabilitation. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Henley prepared to announce the sentence. William Crawford, I hereby sentence you to death by lethal injection for the first-degree murder of Sarah Catherine Mills. This sentence reflects not only the heinous nature of your crime, but also your 20-year pattern of manipulation and deception that has traumatized an entire community. Crawford showed no visible reaction to the death sentence, but several of Sarah's supporters wept with relief. Within days of his sentencing, Crawford's defense team filed an automatic appeal to the Virginia Supreme Court, as required in all death penalty cases. While we respect the judge's decision, we believe there are grounds for appeal based on the use of genetic genealogy evidence and questions about Bill's mental competency. The death penalty should be reserved for the most heinous crimes and, we'll argue, that Bill's mental illness should have been considered more heavily in sentencing. Legal experts predicted that Crawford's case would become a landmark precedent for the use of genetic genealogy evidence in capital murder cases. Crawford versus Commonwealth will likely be cited in courtrooms across the country. The scientific reliability of genetic genealogy, the privacy implications of using commercial DNA databases, and the psychological profile of someone who can maintain such elaborate deception for decades, all of these issues will influence how similar cases are prosecuted. With Crawford's sentencing complete, the Riverside District began the difficult process of healing from 20 years of uncertainty and the shocking revelation about their trusted neighbor. Knowing that Crawford will never be free again brings some comfort, but it doesn't erase the feelings of betrayal. How do you rebuild trust when someone you've known for decades turns out to be a killer? It's changed how I look at everyone. The community organized counseling sessions for residents struggling with the psychological impact of Crawford's deception. The residents of this neighborhood experienced a unique form of trauma. They didn't just lose their sense of safety when Sarah was killed. They lost their ability to trust their own judgment about people's character when they learned about Crawford's dual life. Some longtime residents chose to move away rather than continue living in a community forever associated with Crawford's crimes. We sold the house and left Lynchburg 6 months after Crawford's arrest. Our children had grown up thinking of him as a hero, someone who saved people. Learning that he was actually a killer was too much for them to process. We needed a fresh start somewhere else. Crawford's case prompted significant changes in how Virginia law enforcement agencies approach cold cases and background checks for volunteers. We've established new protocols for genetic genealogy investigations and created specialized units trained in this technology. Crawford's case showed us that advances in DNA analysis can solve cases we thought were unsolvable. Police departments across Virginia implemented new screening procedures for volunteers and civilian employees, including periodic re-evaluations and psychological assessments. We learned that a clean background check and community reputation aren't guarantees of trustworthiness. Crawford had fooled everyone, including law enforcement professionals who worked with him regularly. We've had to completely rethink how we evaluate people's character. The Crawford case gained national attention as one of the most striking examples of genetic genealogy solving a cold case involving a trusted community member. Crawford represents a new category of offender that we're seeing more frequently as genetic genealogy solves older cases. These are individuals who committed crimes decades ago and then integrated themselves into their communities so successfully that they became above suspicion. The case was featured in forensic science, textbooks, and training programs for law enforcement agencies across the country. The Crawford case demonstrates how advances in science can expose the most carefully constructed deceptions. It also shows us that the people capable of the most elaborate lies are often those who seem the most trustworthy on the surface. 21 years after her death, Sarah Mills's legacy extended far beyond her brief teaching career. The scholarship fund established in her name had grown to over $500,000, supporting dozens of future educators. Sarah's scholarship recipients have gone on to teach thousands of children across Virginia. In a way, her influence on education has been far greater in death than it could have been in life. That's Sarah's real victory over Bill Crawford. Her positive impact has multiplied exponentially. The Sarah Mills Memorial Garden, planted at Riverside Elementary School, became a place where former students and colleagues could reflect on her life and legacy. When I visit Sarah's garden, I try to focus on the person she was, not how she died. She was someone who made children excited about learning, who stayed late to help struggling students, who bought classroom supplies with her own money. That's the Sarah I want to remember. Detective Amanda Foster, whose determination had ultimately solved the case, reflected on the 12-year journey that had consumed much of her career. Solving Sarah's case was the most satisfying moment of my law enforcement career, but it was also sobering. Learning that the killer had been hiding in plain sight for 20 years made me question how many other cases might involve perpetrators who are still living among us. Still trusted by their communities, Foster had been promoted to chief of detectives largely based on her work on the Mills case and had implemented new cold case review protocols across the department. Sarah's case taught me that we can never give up on victims, no matter how old their cases become. Science keeps advancing, witnesses sometimes remember new details, and perpetrators sometimes make mistakes that expose them decades later. Crawford's case became a cornerstone example in discussions about the future of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. The technology that caught Crawford is advancing rapidly. We're now able to extract DNA from smaller samples, analyze degraded evidence that was previously useless, and identify suspects through more distant family connections. Cold cases that seemed hopeless 10 years ago are becoming solvable. Privacy advocates raised concerns about the use of commercial DNA databases in criminal investigations, leading to new regulations and guidelines. While we support using technology to solve violent crimes, the Crawford case highlights the need for clear guidelines about when and how genetic genealogy can be used. People who submit DNA to ancestry websites don't expect it to be used to investigate their relatives. As of late 2024, William Crawford remained on death row at Red Onion State Prison, awaiting the outcome of his appeals. Former colleagues and neighbors struggled to reconcile their memories of him with the reality of his crimes. I still have trouble processing that the man who saved my life is a killer. It makes you question everything you think you know about human nature. How do you trust your instincts about people when they can be so wrong? Crawford's ex-wife Patricia had moved to another state and changed her name, seeking to escape the notoriety associated with his crimes. I've spent the last year in therapy, trying to understand how I lived with a killer for 12 years without knowing it. The hardest part is accepting that there probably weren't any signs I missed. Bill was just that good at lying. The Crawford case left the community of Lynchburg grappling with philosophical questions about the nature of evil and the reliability of human judgment. Crawford challenges our assumptions about how killers behave after committing their crimes. We expect them to be consumed by guilt or to make mistakes that expose them. Crawford did neither. He channeled his need for control into community service and seemed to thrive on his secret knowledge. The case sparked ongoing research into the psychology of individuals who can compartmentalize violent behavior while maintaining exemplary public personas. Understanding how someone like Crawford functions could help us identify similar individuals before they kill, rather than after. It's possible that there are other trusted community members living double lives right now. As 2024 drew to a close, the residents of Maple Street faced the reality that their neighborhood would forever be associated with one of Virginia's most shocking cold case revelations. 20 years ago, we thought our worst nightmare was having an unknown killer in our midst. Learning that the killer was someone we'd trusted and admired was somehow even worse. It's changed how I look at everyone, and I'm not sure that will ever go back to normal. The house at 1247 Maple Street, where Sarah Mills had been murdered, was purchased by a non-profit organization and converted into a crisis counseling center for victims of violent crime. Knowing that Sarah's house is now being used to help other victims brings some meaning to her death. She always wanted to help people, and in a way, she still is. The murder of Sarah Catherine Mills exposed the darkest truth about human nature, that evil can hide behind the most trusted faces in our communities. William Crawford's 20-year deception shattered a town's sense of security and challenged fundamental assumptions about how we evaluate character and trustworthiness. The technology that ultimately caught Crawford, genetic genealogy combined with determined detective work, offers hope that other cold cases will be solved and other families will find closure. But Crawford's ability to fool an entire community for 2 decades serves as a chilling reminder that we may never truly know the people around us. The question that haunted Maple Street was no longer who killed Sarah Mills. It was how someone could look into the faces of grieving friends and neighbors for 20 years, knowing all along that he was the cause of their pain. That question may never be fully answered, but Sarah's story stands as testament to the power of science, persistence, and the refusal to let victims be forgotten. In the end, justice came to Maple Street not through the traditional tools of investigation, but through the relentless march of scientific progress and one detective's unwillingness to let a case go cold. Sarah Catherine Mills may have been silenced in 2004, but her story ultimately spoke loudly enough to expose the truth that had been hiding in plain sight for 20 years. Today, children play on Maple Street once again, their parents watching from front porches with a vigilance that previous generations never felt necessary. The trust that once defined this neighborhood may never fully return, but the knowledge that Sarah's killer can never hurt anyone again has allowed the community to begin healing. In a case that challenged everything they believed about human nature, the residents of Maple Street learned that sometimes the most important truth is the hardest one to accept. Evil doesn't always announce itself with warning signs. Sometimes it volunteers for the fire department and coaches Little League Baseball, hiding behind a smile and a badge until science finally exposes what lies beneath. September 21st, 2025. 1 year after William Crawford's death sentence and 21 years after Sarah Mills' murder, we return to Lynchburg to see how this shocking case has permanently changed the lives of everyone it touched. I've been promoted twice since solving Sarah's case, but I still think about her every day. Her photo sits on my desk as a reminder that we can never give up on victims, no matter how cold their cases become. We've since solved 4 more cold cases using genetic genealogy, and each one feels like honoring Sarah's memory. Foster has become a national expert on genetic genealogy investigations, consulting with police departments across the country and testifying before Congress about the technology's potential. Sarah's case opened doors I never expected. I've helped train over 500 detectives in genetic genealogy techniques. Every solved case traces back to what we learned investigating her murder. In a way, Sarah's death is still saving lives by helping us catch other killers. The Lynchburg Volunteer Fire Department underwent complete restructuring following Crawford's conviction. Fire Chief Marcus Webb implemented psychological evaluations for all volunteers and mandatory counseling for members struggling with the betrayal. We lost 6 volunteers who couldn't handle the knowledge that they'd worked alongside a killer. The trust that's essential to firefighting was shattered. We've rebuilt with new protocols, but the innocence is gone forever. Every new volunteer now undergoes extensive background checks and psychological screening. The department erected a memorial plaque honoring Sarah Mills, acknowledging their failure to detect Crawford's true nature and their commitment to never repeat such an oversight. That plaque reminds us daily that our duty to protect the community extends beyond fighting fires. We failed Sarah Mills by not seeing through Crawford's facade. We can't bring her back, but we can ensure no one like Crawford ever infiltrates our ranks again. Maple Street has physically changed since 2004. New families have moved in, unaware of the street's dark history, until longtime residents share the story. The house at 1247 Maple Street, now the Sarah Mills Crisis Center, serves as both memorial and mission. I'm one of only 3 original neighbors still living here. Most families moved away after Crawford's arrest. They couldn't handle knowing they'd lived so close to evil for so long. The new residents are nice, but they'll never understand what we went through. Robert Jenkins, now 78, has become the unofficial neighborhood historian, sharing Sarah's story with newcomers as both warning and remembrance. I tell every new family about Sarah and about Crawford. Not to scare them, but so they understand why we lock our doors, why we watch each other's houses, why we don't automatically trust everyone who seems helpful. Trust has to be earned now, not given freely. Rebecca Mills Cooper has channeled her grief into advocacy, becoming a spokesperson for cold case victims' families and genetic genealogy research. Losing Sarah was devastating, but not knowing who killed her was torture. At least now we have answers. I speak at conferences about the importance of never giving up on cold cases. Science keeps advancing, and families deserve hope that their loved one's killer will be caught. The Sarah Mills Memorial Scholarship has grown beyond its original scope, now funding an entire educational program at James Madison University for future teachers. Sarah's legacy has touched hundreds of students who might become teachers because of her scholarship. That's how she's truly defeated Crawford, by multiplying the good she wanted to do in the world. Ashley Romano, now 29 and a third-grade teacher herself, carries Sarah's memory into her own classroom. Every day, I try to be the teacher Miss Mills was, patient, caring, and completely devoted to my students. When I received her scholarship, it felt like she was still looking out for me. Now I'm looking out for other children the way she would have. Romano has started a program where her students write letters to Sarah, expressing their gratitude for her sacrifice and their teacher's inspiration. My students may not have known Miss Mills, but they understand that someone very special died so that they could learn about kindness and courage. Her story teaches them that good people sometimes face terrible things, but their goodness lives on. William Crawford remains on death row, having exhausted most of his appeals. Former colleagues who once considered him a hero now struggle with the psychological impact of his deception. I've changed my name and moved across the country, but I can't escape what Bill did. Therapy helps, but knowing I shared a bed with a killer for 12 years haunts me. I've testified in 3 documentaries now, hoping my story might help other women recognize warning signs I missed. Crawford's case has become a textbook study in criminal psychology programs nationwide, analyzing how someone can compartmentalize such contradictory behaviors. Crawford represents the most dangerous type of offender, one who can seamlessly integrate violence and altruism. He genuinely saved lives as a firefighter while harboring the secret of taking a life. Understanding this duality is crucial for preventing future crimes. The Crawford case accelerated adoption of genetic genealogy across Virginia, leading to 23 additional cold case arrests in 2025 alone. Sarah Mills's case proved that genetic genealogy could solve the most challenging investigations. We've since identified killers from the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. Every arrest represents another family getting closure, another dangerous person off the streets. Virginia became the first state to establish dedicated genetic genealogy units in all major police departments. Directly inspired by the Mills investigation, Sarah's case changed everything about how we approach cold cases. We now have teams specifically trained in genetic genealogy, working exclusively on unsolved murders. The technology that caught Crawford is catching killers across the state. The case has influenced criminal justice policy nationally, with the FBI incorporating Crawford's deception techniques into training programs for behavioral analysts. Crawford shattered the profile of how we expect killers to behave after their crimes. He showed us that some perpetrators don't deteriorate or make mistakes. They integrate and excel. We've had to completely revise our understanding of post-crime behavior. Legal scholars cite Crawford v. Commonwealth as a landmark case establishing the admissibility and reliability of genetic genealogy evidence in capital murder trials. Crawford's case will be studied in law schools for decades. It established crucial precedents about genetic genealogy evidence and demonstrated how scientific advances can solve cases that seemed impossible 20 years ago. 21 years after Sarah Catherine Mills was murdered in her bedroom, her killer sits on death row while her memory inspires new generations of educators and investigators. Crawford's case taught me that evil can wear any face, carry any badge, perform any good deed. But it also showed me that truth eventually emerges, that science and determination can expose even the most elaborate deceptions. Sarah's death wasn't in vain if it prevented others and caught more killers. The technology that solved Sarah's case continues advancing, offering hope to thousands of families with unsolved losses. Every morning, I come to work knowing that today might be the day we solve another cold case, give another family answers, take another killer off the streets. Sarah's case showed us it's possible. Now it's our responsibility to make it happen. In Lynchburg, Virginia, children now learn Sarah Mills' name alongside those of historical figures. A teacher whose death taught lessons about justice, perseverance, and the power of science to reveal truth. Sarah's story is part of our curriculum now. Students learn about DNA, about cold case investigations, about how advancing technology can solve old mysteries. But mostly, they learn about a teacher who cared so much about children that her memory still protects them 21 years later. The house where Sarah Mills died now helps victims of violent crime heal and rebuild their lives, a transformation that would have made the compassionate teacher proud. Sarah Catherine Mills was silenced on March 15th, 2004, but her voice still echoes through classrooms, courtrooms, and crime labs across America. The man who killed her thought he had committed the perfect crime, hiding behind a hero's facade for 20 years. But science, persistence, and an unwillingness to forget ensured that Sarah's story was heard and her killer exposed. Today, children play safely on Maple Street because a teacher's death taught a community to be vigilant, investigators to be relentless, and scientists to keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible. In the end, evil may hide for decades, but truth, like Sarah Mills's legacy, is eternal. The documentary series concludes where it began, on Maple Street, where a teacher's brutal murder became a 21-year journey toward justice, forever changing how we investigate cold cases and how carefully we examine the faces behind the badges we trust. Sarah Mills' legacy lives on in every solved case, every protected child, and every truth finally revealed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.